everybody, welcome to this tutorial for how to sew the zero-waist cardigan. Let's get started with this one. This is a smaller size. I'm sewing a little sample for my son, and you can see I've started to cut the pieces out here. I've got my sleeve with the sleeve head already cut out, cut from a double layer of fabric here. I could label the sleeves and sleeve heads and put them aside. Here's the main body. I've cut out this armhole cutout, and then I've already trimmed it down to be the elbow patch, and this little scrap here I can put with my other cutting scraps, put those away. And of course I cut the neckline out here too. So the first step that we're going to work on after getting everything cut out is of course the interfacing. And the question about whether to interface the sleeve patches or not, I decided not to on this one, but I am going to interface the front center where the buttons or snaps are going to go. This is again a double layer of fabric here, and I'm taking a 2 centimeter wide strip of interfacing and I'm going to iron it on here. The other place that I need to interface is the facing, which I've cut out from the front. It's going to be the facing on the back, and what I want to do is rotate this 90 degrees because that's how we're going to be using it, and then iron on a small piece of interfacing at the top part mostly. After I've done that, you can see that I've got my two facings here, and I'm going to trim them a little bit just so that it doesn't have this sort of weird reverse heart shape. I'm just going to trim them a little bit so that they are more, I don't know, so that they're less curvy, I guess. And then it'll be a nice smooth curve when we sew it onto the back of the cardigan at a later step. And at the front here you can see that I've interfaced this 2 centimeters worth and I folded it over. This is what the front looks. Of course I did it in both of them. And I'm going to start adding my bias binding to the front of the neck here. I'm going to trim one end to be a bias so that it's a 90-degree angle. And what I'm going to do first is to take this 2 centimeters fold over and fold it back the other way, so right sides together, and stick a pin in there to hold that. And then after I've done that, I'm going to put this bias binding on top of it, right sides together, starting not quite at the fold, maybe a centimeter or so away. And then I'm going to pin it all around. I'm trying as hard as I can not to pull on this while I'm pinning. In fact, I'm trying to compress it a little bit because the more bias binding we can get attached to the edge, the smoother it's going to be. So we speed up a little bit here to do the pinning. And then after that, after I've sewn it on, I'm going to press the seam towards the bias binding, and then I'm going to clip into the seam, and then after I've clipped I'm going to do my understitching. So I'm pressing up and then I'm understitching, stitching through the bias binding and the seam allowance underneath it. This is what it looks like after I've understitched, and the understitching will help turn to the right side and help it stay on the right side after we've turned it. So working on the wrong side now, I can trim off the rest of the bias binding. We're not going to need it anymore. And I'm making 2 folds here. The first one, just the bias binding, and then folding the whole thing over again. In fact, wait a second, we can get a little bit closer and see what that looks like. This is my magnificent camera technique here. So we're going to fold over first the bias binding, just over the seam allowance, and then folding the whole thing over. And you can see there's a tiny bit of the right side of the fabric showing on the back. That's perfectly fine. In fact, that's great because it means bias binding will not be showing on the front, which is what we don't want. So I'm folding over once, twice again, there, and just sticking a couple of pins in. Yeah, from the front or from the back, whatever works. Maybe one more in the middle. And you can see it's already very smooth looking. The clipping plus the understitching has helped it. I haven't even ironed it and it's already laying very smooth. So that's a good sign, definitely. And after pinning it, the one thing we have to do before sewing is to also turn the facing back the other way. Just turning this back over, so again it's wrong sides together. And I'll do that along the whole length of it. And after I've turned the whole thing over, then I'm going to stitch all the way from top to bottom. I think I'm going to use a decorative stitch on this one. So the next thing we're going to work on is going to be the shoulder seam. And we're going to fold the front and back right sides together. You can match up the armhole cutout. That should be symmetrical on both sides. And yeah, the fold of the facing should line up with the back there. I'm not sure why mine doesn't. I think the fabric got stretched out a little bit, but yours should line up very nicely there. Let's just ignore that there. And we're lining up the top, of course, as well, and ignoring that part that doesn't. And we're going to get our facings here. We're going to need one facing for each side. And yeah, the one that has the corners is the one that's going to go here so that the corners line up. That's how it's going to line up. But first, let's draw in the shoulder seam. What you want to draw is starting about 1 centimeter down where the neckline is, and about 3 centimeters, and not about, exactly 3 centimeters down on the arm side. Mine's a little bit less because this is a tinier size, but yeah, yours should be 3 centimeters. And drawing in the line nice and straight there. That's going to be your shoulder seam. After that, we're going to lay the facing on top and use the pen or your fingernail to sort of feel where the edge of the neckline is. And then draw that in as lightly, doesn't need to be too dark. And then put in the rest of the shoulder seam. Then measure about 3-4 centimeters down and draw in the back neckline. Now we're going to pin this all together, and then we're going to sew all the way across there. After we've sewn across, it looks something like this. And I can turn this right side out just to check that it's a nice corner there. Oh, this corner's a little bit bulky, so I think I'm going to trim that a little bit. And I'm trimming down the seam allowance, of course, that's the main point here, and clipping into the corner so that it can lay nice and flat. Trimming off the seam allowance here. You want to save these scraps, especially these scraps with the interfacing on them will be useful for practicing the buttonholes later if you're doing buttonholes, or your snap installation. It can be useful for that. So save those for later. And I'm just clipping into the seam allowance here, and seeing this corner as well. Yeah, these are a little bulky. I'm going to trim them down. Yeah, you can see how bulky that is. It's not very smooth. So I'm going to trim this just like that. Sorry about the construction upstairs. I hope you can't hear the hammering too much. But after I've trimmed it off, you can see how beautifully nice and smooth that corner is, the back and the front, the way they join up. And now we're going to join, excuse me, we're going to join the center back seam. I've laid out this half of the cardigan right side up, and I've got this seam where the facing joins the back. The seam is towards the facing. And then I'm going to lay both sides together, right sides together, and simply sew up the center back seam with this seam here towards the facing on both sides, on both facings. Let's sew that all up. And after sewing it up, this is what it looks like. I'm going to press this seam open, or at least I'm going to finger press it open for now. We'll get a little closer so we can see how this looks. And then I'm turning this whole thing towards the back, wrong sides together. Again, a little bit of the front is showing at the top there. That's fine. It means the facing's not going to show. And I'm just smoothing everything out here. It's a little bit hard because, of course, the front and the back are also connected at where the side seam would be. But I'm smoothing everything out. These shoulder seams are pressed towards the back. I'm pinning them in place. And then I'm going to bring the whole thing over to my computer to my sewing machine, and sew across the shoulder seam, down around the facing, and then same on the other side as well. Again, I'm going to use a decorative stitch for this. It doesn't even really show up though. The sleeves. When you cut out the sleeves, each sleeve head is cut from itself. What does that mean? Yeah, let me just show you instead. When you were cutting out the sleeves, they all had this sleeve head cut out, and we're going to use each sleeve head cut out with the one that you cut it from. So you're just going to pivot it up around like this, and then with right sides together, we're joining the sleeve head to the sleeve, sewing with the seam allowance, which will get you right to the little crook there, and when you fold it out, you'll have a nice smooth sleeve head, that looks just like a traditional one, except it has a seam there. So here's one that I've already done, actually two that I've already done, a pair. These ones have the sleeve head sewn on. Oops, we can go back a little bit more. And I'm going to be adding the arm patches, elbow patches, gracefully, obviously. And I think for these ones, what I'm gonna do is to actually use the reverse side just for a little bit of contrast, and because why not? So I want to find the center of the sleeve where the elbow is. The easiest way to do this is to check it on your own arm, but my son's not at home, so I'm going to just sort of guess. It's going to be here. That looks about right. I also try folding it this way, mashing look to the corner. That seems a little low. I think I'm going to put it up a little bit more. But anyway, I'm going to position this, and then I'm going to sew it on. Again, I use the decorative stitch, and again, you can't see it. Okay, this is what it looks like. I've done it with the other one also, of course. And then I'm going to take the two other sleeves, the ones that don't have the elbow patches on them. And oh, I do love that you can see the selvage here. That's great. Okay, and I'm lining them up right sides together. This is the point where if you hadn't pressed these seams open, you would press one up and one down just so that they butt together and have a little bit less bulk. But in any case, we're lining this up and we're going to sew both sides of the sleeves. Be sure you're lining up one plain and one with the elbow patch, not the two together. After sewing them, we can turn the sleeves right sides out. We're going to have to for our next step, which is going to be sewing them into the cardigan. Here we can have our cardigan, which is wrong side out, and we're going to be sewing the sleeves in. We need to have the side seam here. Either you marked it when you were cutting, or if you didn't, you can just find it easily because the sleeve opening is symmetrical, and you can mark it at the bottom there. And after that, we just have to make sure that we get the right sleeve into the right hole. We want our elbow patches to be at the back, of course. And yes, I have sewn them in wrong before, of course. If I put this sleeve here, you can see this is going to be the wrong way because the elbow patch is facing us, and we want the elbow patch facing the back. That's where it needs to be. So this sleeve goes on this side, and I'm lining everything up, right sides together. The side seam matches with the bottom seam of the sleeve. I can stick a pin in there. And the seam in the top of the sleeve is of course matching with the shoulder seam there. So I can pin that together as well. And you may want to put more pins in. This one's a little bit small, so I think I'm just going to go sew it all around. And of course I'll sew the other one as well. After sewing it around, here's what we've got. It's starting to look almost finished now. That's good. Oh, that looks nice. But okay, we're going to turn everything wrong side out again to show you how we can finish the sleeves. There's two ways to finish the sleeves. I'm not actually doing either now because I need to test it on my son to see how long his arms are. But method one is simply the simple hem, which would be to fold it up and just sew all around. Probably that's what I'm going to end up doing. The other method would be to do a cuff. So this is our imaginary cuff. Can you imagine that this is something that I've cut off? If you cut off 18 centimeters of your sleeve, this is what it would look like. You had this extra piece cut off, yes. And one part of it is slightly narrower. We want that to end up on the inside of the cuff. So we're going to open up the seams like this. You'd have one at the other side also. And fold it wrong sides together like this. I'm keeping the narrow part on the inside of the cuff. Yeah, lining everything up nicely now. Of course, no, that's great. Well, see, even doesn't matter if I drop it or not. The narrow part's still on the inside, so we know that. Anyway, your cuff's going to be a little bit bigger, but principle is the same. And then we're going to put it inside the sleeve like this, matching up the seams with the seams in the sleeve and sewing all around. And then the cuff would be finished. But like I said, I'm going to wait for my son to come home. So let's move on to the next step, and that would be the bottom. The bottom hem, again, there's two ways to finish it. One way would be simply just fold it up a couple of centimeters depending on what length you want and zoom it across with some sort of decorative or hem stitch. But the other method, the one I prefer, is to make this mock band. Again, we're going to fold up a bit of it, a few centimeters worth, wrong sides together, and then the same amount, again, right sides together. Let me show you what that looks like. We have this little accordion fold, first wrong sides together and then right sides together. And I'm going to sew across close to the fold, sewing all 3 layers, and I'll have this beautiful mock band that looks like that. And then it looks like this when it's finished. I've already pressed this in place, pressing it up, since that's where there's fewer layers. And this is more or less finished now. I still need to do the sleeves when my son comes home. And of course, we also want to do the snaps or the buttons at the front here. But again, I'm going to wait for my son because he likes that part, so we're going to do that together. But that's basically it. This is the cardigan. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comments or contact me on social media. But that's basically it.